gentlemen. I am Suri Mudgil, a research associate at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of ICS, let me welcome you all to the ICS Wednesday seminar. The topic for today's discussion is economic and political crisis in Sri Lanka and the role of India and China. As we are aware, Sri Lanka today faces an unprecedented economic crisis that threatens to undo much of the progress that the country has done since the end of its civil war. On the list of countries to which Sri Lanka owes the most debt, India ranks third, only behind China and Japan. It is therefore that India should play a significant role in the country and help the country in meet its financial commitments during the time of need, and must provide any assistance that is required by Sri Lanka to reduce its dependence on China. On the other hand, the Chinese investment in Sri Lanka have time and again failed to generate the kind of local employment or revenue expected to them to justify the debt, often compelling the Sri Lankan government to default and thereby surrender strategically located townships or ports. To further understand this fluid situation in Sri Lanka, we have a panel put together to discuss the same. To chair this session, we have with us Ambassador Ashok Kanta. He is the director of Institute of Chinese Studies since 2017, a career diplomat. He was ambassador of India to China until January 2016. Our first speaker for the day is Dr. Chulani Atanaika. She is a research fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Her research focuses on China and its policies in South Asia. Our second speaker for the day is Michael Kugelman. He is Deputy Director of the Asia Program and the Senior Associate for South Asia at the Wilson Center. He's a leading specialist on Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan and their relations with the United States. Our final speaker for the day is Dr. Deep Pal. He's a visiting scholar in the Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. His most recent project examines the nature and influence of Chinese involvement in South Asia. Before I invite the chair to begin the proceedings, let me lay out the housekeeping rules. All participants, except for the speaker, shall be muted for the duration of the webinar. Participants are requested to send in their questions via the chat box or raise hand option. Please unmute yourself only when called upon to do so by the chair. I now invite the chair to begin the proceedings. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Survi. Thank you for that introduction, and also for putting together this very distinguished panel featuring Dr. Chulani Atanaike, Dr. Michael Kugelman, and Dr. Deep Pal. As Survi just explained, we are today going to discuss political and economic crisis in Sri Lanka and kind of role India and China are playing or likely to play in meeting challenges Sri Lanka is facing today. In my introductory remarks, I will briefly outline the genesis and nature of multiple crises, economic and political, that Sri Lanka is facing today, and also, dwell a little bit on the roles of India and China. As you're aware, what we are witnessing in Sri Lanka today is an unprecedented economic crisis, the worst that the island nation has confronted since its independence in 1948. And in turn, this economic crisis has triggered a major political crisis. The economic crisis hasn't happened overnight. This was something building up for quite some time. It's a combination of structural problems and legacy issues in the economy, impact of a series of developments, including the Easter Sunday bombings of April 2019, the COVID pandemic, which has been there since early 2020, and now the Ukrainian crisis, combined with some very serious mismanagement of the economy, as also corruption, which is which has been quite endemic. A combination of authoritarianism, populism, welfarism, and erratic policies has run against hard economic realities and popular anger, all resulting into a perfect storm. I recall from my own days in Sri Lanka from 2009 to 2013 as High Commissioner of India, that then President Matala Rajapaksa, he was pursuing a policy where economic growth was fueled by heavy borrowings by the government, both domestically as well as abroad. Sri Lanka opted for several high-profile infrastructure projects, including Hambantota Port, Matala International Airport, and subsequently the Port City project, none of which have really yielded economic dividends. They were not based on sound feasibility studies. These projects put together have added to vulnerabilities of the Sri Lankan economy, and the growth model which was pursued at that time, as I mentioned, was dependent a great deal on debt, and it also led to external debt of Sri Lanka going up quite a bit. Against this background, as I mentioned earlier, there were a series of developments. For instance, you had Easter Sunday bombings in April 2019, which led to a huge fall in flow of tourists, which in turn caused major strains in foreign exchange earnings. To make matters worse, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, who had just been elected as president, he cut VAT rates in December 2019, abolished nation building tax and some of the levies. And as a result, there was a sharp shrinkage in domestic revenues of Sri Lanka, which was already at a low base. For instance, the VAT revenues decreased by as much as 50% in year 2020. Then came the COVID pandemic in March 2020, which had disastrous consequences for Sri Lanka and so many other countries. Tourism, tea, rubber, and garment exports and remittances abroad, which provided the major sources of revenue and foreign exchange earnings for Sri Lanka, shrunk very rapidly at that point of time. Government of Sri Lanka opted for welfare measures which contributed to the budget deficit exceeding 12% of GDP in 2021. The public debt increased to 120% of GDP by 2021. Foreign exchange reserves, which were around US $7.5 billion towards end of 2019, as you know, they have come to virtually zero at this point of time. The economic crisis was compounded by another self-inflicted injury. In May 2021, you'd recall that President Gotabaya Rajapaksa almost overnight shifted to organic farming, banned import of fertilizers. Though this decision was reversed within a few months, it did lasting damage. The grain output in last 1 year has decreased by something like 50%. You are aware of recent developments in Sri Lankan economy. There is an acute shortage of foreign exchange as Sri Lanka depends on imports of fuel, food, fertilizer, and daily use items. Shortage of foreign exchange will result in massive shortage of these essential commodities. The inflation rate, according to Central Bank of Sri Lanka, is now close to 40%. Sri Lanka defaulted on its sovereign debt on 18th May. This was for the first time since independence that Sri Lanka has done so. The economic crisis and the widespread suffering that it had generated has led to a major political crisis and popular anger that you are aware of. The Rajapaksa family, which dominated the Sri Lankan political landscape, has lost its Sinhala Buddhist constituency. In any case, it had very limited support among the minority communities, Tamils, Muslims, and Christians. But Mahinda Rajapaksa in particular had a solid support base of 40 to 45% among the majority Sinhala Buddhist community, and that has evaporated over last few months as there is palpable anger about mismanagement of economy, widespread corruption, nepotism, and also the fact that there is very real suffering among ordinary people in Sri Lanka. There is a widespread demand that the Rajapakshas must go. You're aware of recent developments, including Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa being nudged by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa to step down as Prime Minister on 9th of May. On 12th May, Ranil Wickremesinghe was sworn in as Prime Minister. The big question that people are asking today, is he the man of the hour? He carries both certain assets and liabilities. He's experienced. He has a fairly high level of acceptance, especially in the West. At the same time, the fact remains that he is the only MP of his party, UNP, in Parliament. So for political survival, he has to depend on support from SLPP and SLFP. Therefore, a legitimate question which can be asked is whether he has agency of his own, or he'll be forced to front for President Gotabaya Rajapaksa. But at the same time, one must note the fact that the political situation has stabilized to an extent since Ranil Wickremesinghe became Prime Minister on 12th May. Though there is continuing demand that Gotabaya Rajapaksa should step down as president, and that there should be systemic changes, not only in the constitution of Sri Lanka, but in the political system as a whole. Now, against this background, the government led by Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has to take some difficult economic decisions. Sri Lanka needs urgent support of the international community for import of fuel and other essential commodities. In a statement in Sri Lankan Parliament yesterday, Ranil mentioned that over the next 6 months, Sri Lanka will be needing $5 billion to pay for imports, another $1 billion to bolster its foreign exchange reserves, which have really shrunk to virtually nothing at this point of time. Sri Lanka, after considerable delay, has initiated discussions with International Monetary Fund, but though IMF support is essential, it's not going to be a panacea for problems Sri Lanka is facing. As you're aware, Sri Lanka has had as many as 16 arrangements with the IMF in the past, including one between 2016 and 2019. Once again, Sri Lanka is trying to get support from IMF, and has also approached other international financial institutions, including the World Bank, ADB, and AIIB for support. It has approached bilateral partner countries for support. And problem is compounded by the fact that Sri Lankan credit ratings have become virtually a junk rate today. As a result, Sri Lanka cannot access international capital markets. Now, coming to the policy of India, Government of India has stated on a number of occasions that its support to Sri Lanka at this point of time is guided by its neighborhood first policy. In a crisis situation, neighborhood, India tries to be the first responder, and that's what it's doing in the present case. Also, when it comes to economic emergency faced by Sri Lanka, through line of credit, currency swap arrangements, and other means, since beginning of this year, India has extended support in excess of 3.5 billion US dollars. There's also been some support from government of Tamil Nadu and from civic society entities in India. The total support given by India to Sri Lanka is in the neighborhood of 6 billion US dollars. India also has rushed in petroleum products, food, medicines, and other essential commodities against credit line. And this support has been received quite positively in Sri Lanka, cutting across party lines. One key challenge that India faces in responding to the needs of Sri Lanka is how to assist without being seen as propping up the Rajapaksas. Because as I mentioned earlier, Rajapaksas have become very unpopular at this point of time. I believe that India has been fairly successful in maintaining a balanced posture where it is supporting the people of Sri Lanka without being seen as bailing out the Rajapakshas. And here I would like to in particular refer to an important and well-crafted statement made by the official spokesperson of Ministry of External Affairs of India on 9th May, where he talked about India's historical ties with Sri Lanka and India being fully supportive of Sri Lanka's democracy, stability, and economic recovery. In keeping with our neighborhood policy, first policy, India will always be guided by the best interests of the people of Sri Lanka expressed through democratic processes. The point to note here is that this statement, as well as other statements made by the government of India, do not refer to the government of Sri Lanka. Instead, focus is on the people of Sri Lanka and democratic processes in Sri Lanka. The government of India would not like to be seen as interfering in Sri Lanka, but at the same time would like to use the crisis to make India the friend of first resort across the political spectrum in Sri Lanka. Now, coming to the Chinese stance with respect to the unfolding economic and political crisis in Sri Lanka, what comes across very clearly is that the Chinese have been very cautious and they are biding their time. In a very important interview given to the Bloomberg on Monday, 6th of June, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa mentioned that Sri Lanka could not tap a credit line of $1.5 billion from China because of conditionalities laid by Beijing, and he's yet to hear back on his request to President Xi Jinping for a $1 billion loan to buy essential commodities. Gotabaya stated very bluntly, and he's known to be a blunt person, that China appeared to be shifting its strategic focus towards Southeast Asia and Africa. He noted that South Asian countries in financial trouble were no longer getting the same attention of China as before. This is one point which we can perhaps discuss in our dialogue later today. Now, another point I would like to make with regard to the Chinese role is that while the crisis in Sri Lanka is not a made in China crisis, the Chinese do share a fair part of the blame for Sri Lanka's present predicament. I refer to vanity projects like Hambantota Port, Matala International Airport, and Port City project, which were taken up, and how these projects, which were largely funded out of commercial loans given by China, have not resulted in economic dividends for Sri Lanka. And though it's mentioned that Sri Lankan debt to China, just about 10% of Sri Lanka's overall debt, the actual number might be higher because, given the opacity of Chinese lendings to Sri Lanka and also commercial lendings which have taken place. China also has not responded positively to the government of Sri Lanka's proposal that there should be restructuring of debt. Instead, China would like to go for refinancing of debt, which will not work out if Sri Lanka has to go for IMF program, which is essential and unavoidable at this point of time. India, on its part, has responded positively to the suggestion for debt restructuring. It has also been very supportive of the government of Sri Lanka's efforts to secure assistance from IMF. On IMF issue, once again, China has publicly expressed its reservations, so it has not been very helpful. Now, why India is supporting Sri Lanka at this point of time? An argument at times is made that this is mainly because of India's concerns about China's growing footprints in Sri Lanka. I would suggest that though Chinese presence in Sri Lanka, especially in the strategic and security domains, is a matter of concern for India, Indian policy today is being guided more by its neighborhood first policy. Sri Lanka for India is a country of great strategic significance, and India cannot afford to see prolonged political and economic crisis in Sri Lanka, given close historical, societal, economic, political, and security linkages that India and Sri Lanka have. So I believe those broader considerations are more important than just the desire to counter China. Now, I expect that India will remain closely engaged, both in terms of economic assistance to Sri Lanka and monitoring the political situation without getting intervening or mediating anyway in the political stalemate that Sri Lanka faces today. I think on that India has been very careful, and that has been a policy consistently, including when I was High Commissioner in Colombo. India is likely to continue to provide emergency economic assistance to Sri Lanka within its limitations, but India cannot possibly bail out Sri Lanka on its own. So support from international community is very important, and this is another area where India has actively intervened with IMF to fast track its assistance for Sri Lanka. India has also taken up, argued the case for Sri Lanka with Japan, other G7 countries, and as a result, G7 finance ministers meeting on 20th May issued a statement supporting debt relief for Sri Lanka. Now, one challenge Sri Lanka faces today is the fact that there is international apathy with regard to crisis that Sri Lanka and many of the countries are facing today. There is a very high level of preoccupation among the Western countries with what's happening in Ukraine, which is kind of sucking the oxygen out of the system. Ranil Wickremesinghe has sought India's support in promoting an Aid Sri Lanka consortium. I'm not aware of any public statement made by India on this issue, but generally India has avoided being seen as a donor country. We look upon our involvement in situations like this more in terms of economic partnership, and that's what we are doing in Sri Lanka. In fact, Sri Lanka happens to have a higher per capita GDP than India. So India cannot possibly be a donor in this situation, but it will intervene with international community to the maximum extent possible, apart from extending its own support there. Final point I would like to make is that Sri Lanka will have a long and painful period of transition to get over its current economic and political predicament. There are systemic issues underlying multiple crises faced by Sri Lanka. So it's not going to be easy to overcome these challenges. Today we have a very strong panel to try and understand the genesis and nature of political and economic crisis faced by Sri Lanka, and more specifically look at the roles of India and China in addressing the issues that Sri Lanka is confronting today. Let me start with Dr. Chulani Atanaike. She's, as Surbi introduced her, a research fellow with Institute of South Asian Studies at National University of Singapore. She will speak for about 10-12 minutes, and then we'll move on to other two speakers. Over to you, Chulani.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you for the invitation to ICS as well. I mean, I think you set the tone for the entire panel and gave a very comprehensive overview of what's happening that perhaps must have made my job pretty easy. Most of the points that I'll be talking here would be a reiteration of what you already mentioned. Now, as you rightly mentioned, that Sri Lanka is engulfed in an economic crisis resulting from declined forex reserve. That's the sort of like the surface level problem that we see. So there has been ballooning inflation and shortage in oil, gas, food, medical essentials for a couple of months now, which led to the massive protests that started towards the end of March and continued for a couple of weeks, which again turned somewhat violent in the middle. As you rightly mentioned, since Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has sworn in as the new Prime Minister, the political situation has somewhat become stable, but I cannot say that it's completely like there's no instability at all. It's still, but it has been controlled to some extent. And the international response to Sri Lanka also has significantly changed. West have changed its discourse to a certain extent with regard to how it wants to coordinate, negotiate, and communicate with Sri Lanka after Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe came into power. Now, the economic problem is, as again you also mentioned the same point, it's not something that happened overnight, but this is a problem that has its origin in long-term macroeconomic instability and economic. Hello? Hello.
You're audible, Chulani. Go ahead.
Sorry, I think for some reason I'm being prompted to leave the room. So
no, please go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So as I was saying, this problem has been like long-term in the making due to macroeconomic instability and economic mismanagement of successive governments since independence. So it's a problem that has been making in over 7 decades now. So because of that, we have a balance of payment problem and a foreign exchange reserve deficit problem. So Sri Lanka always proudly proclaimed that it is the first country in South Asia or Asia to open the economy in 1970s. But by doing so, Sri Lanka could not achieve the objective of becoming an export-led economy. So successive governments' policy has always been about tax reductions, tax exemption policies, welfare, giving priority for welfare, whether it's education, healthcare, or other aspects, which has resulted in steady decline in government revenue, especially since 1990s. So in 2021 alone, its tax revenue was only 9.6% of the GDP against the expenditure, which is closer to 20% of the GDP. And this situation was exacerbated by President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's misplaced policies such as overnight ban on fertilizer and also the exogenous factors such as the global pandemic and Russia-Ukraine war. Apart from that, there's also the unsustainable external debt problem. Sri Lanka's public debt to GDP ratio rose from 91 to 119 between 2018 and 2021. So as of the end of March in this year, the external debt service payment per year was $6 billion. And its foreign reserve was only $1.9 billion. As of couple of weeks ago, I think it has even reduced further, closer to 50 million or something. I cannot exactly remember the amount. Now, the basic point that I want to highlight is that this is not a problem that came overnight, and it has been in the making. Sri Lanka failed to make its economy an export-led economy. Instead, we are right now an import-led economy. If we look at the successive governments have always been talking about like boosting manufacturing, industrialization, etc., but it has never materialized over the past 7 decades. As a result of that, we depend on everything that's coming out of from abroad. So one of the other points that I wanted to emphasize is the China factor, because now when we talk about the external debt, one of the arguments that has always been asked, especially during these days, whether China is the reason. Now, China's role in Sri Lanka has extensively increased since the early 2000s. And because of that, China's engagement with Sri Lanka and its footprint in the Indian Ocean has significantly increased. So before this period, China was a low-profile partner who provided occasional humanitarian assistance and development support. But its emergence as one of the major partner coincides with its change of policy towards the Indian Ocean region, its entrance into World Trade Organization, its double-digit growth for over a decade. So, and also the end of war in Sri Lanka. When all these things happened, at the same time, Sri Lanka also became a middle-income country, which closed doors for gaining loans and whatever the financial assistance that we get at a low interest rate. Now, as a result of that, at the same time, Sri Lanka required massive infrastructure development post-war, which you rightly mentioned, couple of port development, expressways, energy projects, etc., to which China was one of the major partners. Now, the reason for, at least in my opinion, for China to play a major role was also because that the West, there was a financial crisis going on in West, and countries like India and other partners somewhat shut down against Sri Lanka after the end of the war. With that, it opened an opportunity for China to come and invest in Sri Lanka, provide loans where necessary. I won't say almost all the projects are a failure, especially in terms of port projects. I cannot say they are a failure. I strongly believe that those projects have been a booster for Sri Lanka's economy, especially in the port industry. Let me explain why I say this. And now, Hambantota Port was not a project that came out of the blue, or it was not a project proposed by President Matala Airport alone. This project has been in the making since early 1980s. And this was also brought forward during President Kumaratunga's period, but obviously former President Matala Airport perhaps had more political will to bring this project into focus. And if if you rightly remember, the project was first offered to India, which was rejected. And then, of course, through a loan, it was developed. And obviously, even before this project came into focus, there was a lot of negative marketing happening internationally and domestically against it. But when I talk to the experts in the shipping industry, their perspective from a business perspective is completely different. What they believe is that this was a project that they actually required, and this was something that Sri Lanka required for its development. So in the meantime, then we saw that Sri Lanka went for port expansion in Colombo, which went with and after which China Merchant Port came and invested in one of the terminals, which boosted port industry by 16% growth rate and became one of the fastest growing ports in Sri Lanka. It's the same company that is operating Hambantota port right now. So because of that, I don't think this particular project is, of course, had a major negative impact on Sri Lanka when you look at it in a broader perspective. But obviously, there are other projects that brought low return. For instance, the Matala Airport. Again, this is a project which would have been fruitful if Sri Lankan government also made a proper business plan. Because this is an area where Sri Lanka, the area that is closed down, but it is also closer to areas like Bandaravela, Nuvarelia, where they do a lot of fresh fruit, fresh vegetable, etc. Production. So if it was properly planned, of course, this airport would have been used for air freighting and export industry, but these things obviously did not happen. Now, as a result of that, we are here today, which has created this situation. Now, having said that, as you rightly mentioned, China is not the only reason for Sri Lanka's debt problem. The majority of Sri Lanka's debt is with financial markets, to which Sri Lanka has to go because after becoming a middle income country. And the percentage, if I am not wrong, closer to between 49 to 51% of Sri Lanka's total debt. Debt with China is equal to the debt with Japan, and the percentage of interest is at a fixed rate of 2% usually. That's the concessional rate they have been provided. So right now, as Sri Lanka is moving to IMF negotiations in order to come out of this, China has a major role to play, because at the beginning, I think in the introduction also it was mentioned, like after Japan, China is the second largest bilateral donor for Sri Lanka, and then there's India. So these three countries have to agree in order to go for a debt restructuring program for Sri Lanka to get the assistance from IMF. Therefore, China has a major role to play, and this is also a testing time for China in my opinion, for its global image. Because the fact that we are talking about the role that China has to play in Sri Lanka's problem itself says like how Sri Lanka-China relationship has become a high-profile relationship in the international community. So the world is watching, the other countries are watching what China is doing for a partner which was once considered as one of its dependable friend. So in my opinion, China has two problems. Firstly, it does not want to immediately go for a debt restructuring because it will lead to other precedents. China, as we know, China is one of the major creditors for most of the developing countries in Asia and Africa. So if China immediately agree on a debt restructuring program, which means the other countries also would come forward. I don't think China want to face that. On the other hand, if China do not come forward and support Sri Lanka the way it requires to do, then it will also gain have a bad impact on its global image. Then like China will be viewed as a country who abandoned one of its closest partners. So at the moment, I think China is at a dilemma. In the meantime, I see India is doing India's approach towards Sri Lanka has changed significantly through this crisis. As rightly you mentioned, perhaps it's their neighborhood first policy, but also I think India sees this opportunity in order to prove itself as a steadfast friend. In general, among the Sri Lankan public, the opinion about India is that India mostly plays a big brother role when it comes to Sri Lanka, and it sometimes get involved. There have been most of the times where it get involved in domestic politics, and which has created, which has not accepted well within the Sri Lankan public. So at this point of time, I think India wants to make a cautious effort, but also make this an opportunity to establish its role in Sri Lanka as not just as a neighbor, but also as a friend. What I see is that while China is having a dilemma in how to respond to Sri Lanka's crisis, India has found an opportunity to establish itself as a long-term strong partnership.
Thank you, Chilani, for that exposition on what led to economic crisis in Sri Lanka and roles played by China and India in the current situation. I think that was very insightful. I just know one comment on Hambantota Airport and its economic viability. First, let me set the record straight that this perception that India was approached to undertake Hambantota port before it was given to China is not correct. We have not challenged it publicly, but that's not the case. As for economic feasibility of Hambantota port, the very fact that it remains one of the least utilized port, in fact, freighters are forced to go to Hambantota, for instance, for importation of automobiles. The fact that government of Sri Lanka could not service the debt owed to China and was forced to give the port on 99-year lease to Chinese entities, that itself carries a message. And this is a statement by Sri Lankan cabinet. This is not hearsay or anything like that. Just look at the statement which is issued. In any case, we'll come back to it during the subsequent discussion. Let me now turn to our second speaker, Dr. Michael Kugelman. May I invite him to make his opening remarks?
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, and thank you to the chair and to the Institute for inviting me. This is a very distinguished panel, and I'm grateful to be a part of it. I also apologize if I appear to be at a diagonal. I'm having some problems with my webcam, which makes me look askance, but hopefully my audio is okay. So I had been originally asked to discuss Sri Lanka-India relations and India's role in the Sri Lanka crisis, and I'll do that briefly. But first, I thought I'd step back and provide a bit of context that will allow me to articulate how the situation in Sri Lanka is viewed here in Washington. Two of the biggest geopolitical storylines playing out in Asia today are the intensifying strategic competition between the US and China on the one hand, and between India and China on the other. These, of course, are realities that will be very well known to this audience. Both of these rivalries have been sharpening for some time, but they have arguably heated up even more just over the last few years. Trade wars, the emergence of the pandemic, Chinese surveillance policies, China's militarization of South China Sea territorial disputes, among other factors, have all contributed to a US-China competition that has really reached a fever pitch. And meanwhile, China's deepening footprint in South Asia and in the Indian Ocean region, coupled with the deadly Galwan Valley clash 2 summers ago, have heightened India-China competition. Sri Lanka has seemingly become a key strategic battleground for both India-China and increasingly US-China competition. The former is much more visible and advanced. I mean, we all know, and we have heard from our previous speakers, we've heard about the heavy Chinese infrastructure investment that began in Sri Lanka after the end of the Civil War. even as India has continued its own long-standing engagement with Colombo. China, as I think was mentioned before, has been the top source of FDI to Sri Lanka for nearly a decade. It's been the top lender as well. And there also has been, over the years, this perception, and we could discuss how accurate this is or not, this perception that the Rajapaksa family has strong affinities for China. Now, this India-China competition has sometimes in recent months taken some rapid-fire turns, such as a few months back when China became embroiled in a spat with Sri Lanka after Beijing, as I understand it, ordered Colombo to pay for some Chinese fertilizer shipments that Sri Lanka said had gone bad and spoiled. It's very soon after that spat, India announced a new consignment of shipments of fertilizer, which of course had been in very short supply in Sri Lanka. So that was a case of India capitalizing on an opportunity where China ran into a spat with Sri Lanka over this presence of spoiled fertilizer. India swooped in to provide that very important good on its own. Meanwhile, the US has stepped up engagement in South Asia in recent months on very high levels in ways that have gone beyond the usual focus that we've seen in recent years on India and Pakistan and Afghanistan only. And Sri Lanka has been one of these countries that come into sharper strategic focus in Washington. So as many of you will know, the #2 official at the State Department, Victoria Nuland, was in Sri Lanka just a few weeks back. US government messaging about that trip said that it was about, quote, advancing shared interests in the Indo-Pacific, which I think is code for countering China. And indeed, the goal of strengthening ties with Sri Lanka has appeared in multiple US policy documents on the Indo-Pacific strategy going back to the final months of the Trump administration. Sri Lanka, like many other states, does not want to get caught up in these strategic rivalries. It wants to balance its relations with India and with China and with the US, and for that matter with Russia as well. But whereas Sri Lanka may view this strategic tug of war playing out on its soil as a problematic thing, it has arguably benefited from this to an extent during this terrible economic crisis. There is a silver lining of sorts here. And that is that India and China, and increasingly the US, have offered or contemplated offering financial assistance, and at a moment when Sri Lanka can use all the help it can get. So this brings me to the issue of India-Sri Lanka relations and India's role in the country during the crisis. Again, I think the key points have been laid out very nicely by our previous speakers, but I'll just offer a few comments on this. I assume that the official line on India's policy is that it is pursuing close engagement with Sri Lanka through its neighborhood first policy, which of course is meant to emphasize building greater cooperation with countries throughout the region, throughout South Asia. In reality, there are two key factors driving Indian engagement in Sri Lanka. One, of course, is its competition with China. Though it is notable, as I think was mentioned before, this recent interview that President Gotabaya did with Bloomberg, where he indicated very interestingly that he thinks China is losing interest in Sri Lanka, that's looking to Southeast Asia. I'm not sure what I make of that. I'm not sure if I agree. Certainly would be keen to discuss that later. My sense is that the competition between India and China and Sri Lanka remains quite present and quite prevalent. One of the factors driving Indian engagement in Sri Lanka is the China factor. The other factor, which may be a bit less discussed, but I think is quite interesting, is the inroads made by Pakistan in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka, I think, is maybe the only SAARC country, other than Afghanistan, where Pakistan has been able to build considerable influence and ties with key political stakeholders. There's been a fairly warm Pakistan-Sri Lanka defense relationship that's rooted in the support that Pakistan provided to the Sri Lankan military during the final period of the civil war. This means that Sri Lanka is arguably the only South Asian country where both of India's main strategic rivals have been able to develop a good relationship in the case of China, not with Pakistan as much, a notable presence on the ground as well. So India perhaps is keen to push back against Pakistan's efforts to engage with Sri Lanka. Certainly, there are notable challenges to India's relationship with Sri Lanka. Obviously, the main one is China's inroads. China, for a number of years, has used the vehicle of infrastructure investment and development to deepen its presence there. And more recently, I think in line with its broader policy in South Asia, it's used the vehicle of pandemic vaccines to cultivate more influence and goodwill. Of course, India has done this very well on its own in a number of countries throughout South Asia. Another challenge for India-Sri Lanka relations may be the Tamil issue, with India frequently pressing Sri Lanka to do more to empower and better the plight of the Tamil community in Sri Lanka. There are also, of course, maritime disputes, given the absence of a well-defined maritime boundary, which has led to tensions and some confrontations, including violent ones, between Indian fishermen and Sri Lankan security personnel, particularly Navy personnel. So moving forward, what should India's role be in the Sri Lanka crisis? Clearly, it has a major stake in helping Sri Lanka ease the crisis for economic and security reasons. Sri Lanka is a top Indian trade partner. India has a variety of investments in Sri Lanka, from real estate to petroleum, many things in between. Indian sea-based trade is heavily dependent on the Colombo port. And also a crisis spinning out of control in Sri Lanka could mean a surge of refugees to India, which New Delhi presumably would feel would be a challenge and problematic. There have been reports of Tamil families fleeing to India in recent weeks. And if the crisis continues to worsen, that could exacerbate the political instability we've seen, though indeed, as was noted before, it appears that the political crisis has stabilized right now. At any rate, if that political stability for whatever reason were to return, owing to geographic proximity and so on, that means that there is a risk of instability spilling into southern India. India's best bet moving forward, my modest view, would appear to play an apolitical role of economic supporter, whereby it pledges to work with whatever leader in government may happen to be in power in Sri Lanka in order to provide economic support. Certainly, there are things China and other countries can do well and better than India in this regard, such as rapidly mobilizing and deploying large amounts of capital. So for India, perhaps the goal is to leverage its comparative advantage as an economic partner. Of course, it's already finalized a line of credit deal to ensure Sri Lanka is able to better address its food and fuel needs. Beyond that, other logical spaces for India to leverage would be its pharmaceuticals industry, which of course is a really big one. It could perhaps tap into that to produce and supply emergency medicines and vaccines that may be in short supply in Sri Lanka. Job creation, particularly in the tech sector, could be a really useful Indian intervention, bringing more IT jobs to Sri Lanka. And also, India can perhaps leverage its regional partnerships to bring more assistance to Sri Lanka. India, of course, has been a leader in energizing or trying to energize the BIMSTEC grouping, especially with SAARC having been paralyzed by the India-Pakistan dispute. There has been some movement within BIMSTEC in recent months toward new electricity sharing schemes. Perhaps there can be some scope there to explore the possibilities of marshaling some collective support and assistance that can be delivered to Sri Lanka, which of course is one of the BIMSTEC member countries. Similarly, the Quad has enjoyed all kinds of momentum in recent years. It's mainly focused on, or not mainly, but one of its main goals is to provide public goods to the Indo-Pacific. Much of this delivery has appeared to focus on East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands, more so than South Asia. Ideally, the Quad could also look west and focus some of this public goods delivery on Sri Lanka as well. The Quad is working on a vaccine production and distribution initiative, a COVID vaccine production and distribution initiative. And Sri Lanka could perhaps be a useful or a desirable recipient for some of those products. But all this said, and I'll conclude here, a lot of what I'm laying out is a case of putting the cart before the horse, because at this point, the key needs in Sri Lanka include cash, liquidity, and of course, food and fuel relief. So to the extent that India can help out in that regard and gain itself not only more influence, but more goodwill in Sri Lanka, that can be a win-win that would help ease Sri Lanka's crisis and also help advance India's interests, which include strengthening friendship and engagement with Sri Lanka. So I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael, for those comments. Michael Kugelman brought out the larger strategic context in which Sri Lanka is a country of interest for various major players. He outlined drivers for India's Sri Lanka policy and also made this very important point about need for India to work with other partners, including in the Quad arrangement and BIMSTEC. There are quite a few questions already in the chat box, which we'll request Michael to address later. I'll now move to our third speaker, Dr. Deepal. Deep has done some excellent work on Chinese influence in South Asia, and we look forward to his comments. Over to you, Deep.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I'm going to share my screen. I have a short PowerPoint because I've been told that apparently no meeting is over unless someone presents a PowerPoint. So I'm going to quickly share some slides. And the reason why I'm doing this is because, as Ambassador Kantha mentioned, that there's some work that I have been doing on Chinese influence in South Asia. And there are some interesting findings which show up best when we kind of try to look at them through as infographics. So basically, I'm quickly going to run through the basics of the project, which was something that we came out with. It's a report that we came out with at Carnegie Endowment last year, looking at Chinese influence in South Asia. And essentially, what you see on your screens are some questions that we asked, and we were looking at multiple countries, Sri Lanka being one of them. We were looking at Bangladesh, Maldives, Nepal, and so on and so forth. And what we were trying to understand essentially was twofold. What is the nature of the kind of engagement that China has in these countries in South Asia? That's one. And the second part was what does this engagement do? How does this engagement affect these countries, right? And the report obviously came out in English, but also in local languages, including in Sinhala, the cover of which you see on your screens. But basically, what we found was quite interesting, and we looked along three axes. We looked at the effect on institutions, the effect of Chinese engagement on institutions, and that on civil society, as well as how this affects elites in these countries. And what we meant by each of these indicators or variables is something, again, I thought it will be useful to break them up and look at them individually. And I'm not going to go into great details of any of these right now, and we can talk about it later during question and answers if someone is interested. But essentially, when it came to Sri Lanka, as opposed to other countries, we saw some differences, right? And again, what you see on your screens are the various ways in which these played out, right? So the weaknesses in some countries were different from the weaknesses in other countries. The strengths were different, right? And one second, right? So what we found with Sri Lanka was very interesting. In some ways, we found Sri Lanka to be among the best or the strongest in the region, and in some ways it was not so. So if you look at institutions, we found that Sri Lanka had more robust institutions that you will find in other parts of the region, right? However, we also found that the elites were far more compromised or open to influence from Chinese, far more open to Chinese influence than they were elsewhere, which in turn puts a pressure on the institutions. We found the media quite strong in Sri Lanka as opposed to other places. However, at the same time, we found that there is pressure on them from some institutions or from elites. There were instances where Sri Lankan newspapers or public figures were asked to not criticize certain things about China. So these are the various things we found. And what we found was that the most problematic aspect was in fact from the elites, which had gone on for some time. And when I say elites, we obviously, and this is something that has been discussed a number of times here already, the role of the Rajapaksas. And we found that the Rajapaksas, in a way, while the various other administrations that have been in Sri Lanka in the last couple of decades, including the Sirisena government, we found that the Rajapaksas had an oversized relationship with Sri Lanka. And with the various kind of amendments that were being brought about in the Sri Lankan constitution and the various other structural changes that were being brought about, what that was doing was it was in a way institutionalizing the hold of the Rajapaksas of the Rajapaksa family on the various institutions in Sri Lanka. So what does that mean when we look at where things are today or where they can be from here, right? So again, one of the things that has been talked about quite a bit over the last few years is this supposed debt trap, right? That is problematic as far as Chinese engagement in the region is concerned. Chinese engagement in Sri Lanka especially is concerned. What we found was that it wasn't as much as the debt that was being given that was problematic as it was Chinese support to a regime which was corrupt, which was entrenched in various activities that were not strictly going by the institutions of the country that were problematic. For example, we found that Chinese aid or Chinese money, not aid really, Chinese loans, Chinese money, Chinese funds, when they came into Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksas ensured that they circumvented the usual procedures that are required for this money to be allotted and tried and push them towards their own constituencies, right? Multiple speakers have talked about Hambantota, but Hambantota port is not the only project. If you look at the Matala Rajapaksa Airport, if you look at the cricket stadium, there are a number of projects on which a huge amount of money was spent, but without really thinking about whether this was the best use of loans that were being taken, right? And now, today, when we talk about Sri Lanka's financial troubles, there are some numbers that we talk about very quickly. We talk about how the Chinese aid is about 10%. I'm sorry, Chinese debt is about 10%. Japan's debt is a little over 10%, right? We talk about how the greatest amount of debt that Sri Lanka needs service is from sovereign funds, which are ironically from the West. But what we don't think about in all of this is the problem has been from the political engagement or the patronage of a particular regime that has enabled misgovernance, that has enabled corruption. Huge amounts of loans have been taken over multiple years. Even the Colombo Port City project, when we look at that, it's a $1.4 billion project, right? Which means an immense amount of pressure when it comes to servicing these debts. And in the last few years, there has been, in the last few months, there has been effort from the part of Sri Lanka to restructure these loans. There have been conversations. I think Michael was talking about how, or Chulani was talking about how the issue is China does not want to give into reservicing or restructuring these because in a post-COVID world, there are multiple countries that are unable to service the money that they have taken from China. And if China agrees to this, there is a possibility that other countries will also ask the same of China. Now, while that is true, what that also does is, and this is something that we have seen since late last year with the fertilizer episode, right? A ship full of fertilizer sailed round and round Sri Lanka, trying to force the Sri Lankan government into accepting that contaminated fertilizer. The Sri Lankan government did not, but they had to eventually pay $7 million earlier this year as cost of that fertilizer, right? What this indicates is that in the absence of the preferential or the privileged relationship that the Rajapaksas have had with China at a time when things were not so dire, the regime has constantly been encouraged to carry on as if nothing was wrong, as if there was no cost to pay. However, now that things are in significantly worse situation, China is the question that is coming up essentially now is if the kind of relationship that has been engendered in Sri Lanka with the Rajapaksas, with China, is the best kind of relationship that Sri Lanka could have with China, right? Every few days we hear of news reports, or we hear of people talking about, how people in Sri Lanka are talking about how India has come to Sri Lanka's aid far more than China has. I don't think that is the right question to be asking right now. In fact, in the few conversations that I have had with people in Sri Lanka, their focus is elsewhere. Their focus is essentially, and the Indian India's relationship with Sri Lanka is a multifaceted relationship. There are social aspects to it, there are cultural aspects to it, there are religious aspects to it, there are historical aspects to it, and economy or development or partnership economic partnership is just one part of it, and it's obviously a very complicated relationship. But the question that I sense is coming out of Sri Lanka, is coming out of these quarters now, is if the relationship with China has been the best kind of relationship that Sri Lanka could have. And that is a question that will that is a question which will be difficult to answer even moving forward. Because when you look at the last few years, and when you look at where Sri Lanka is now and the way moving forward, as the new Prime Minister has said, that things will get far worse before they get better, which is absolutely true. This is not something that will improve in the next 6 years, in the next 6 months or 1 year or 2 years. This is something that will maybe take Sri Lanka a decade to come out of. Now, China has been the lender of last resort during the last many years. The balance of payments crisis was something that was brewing. Now, the reason why Sri Lanka did not manage to find assistance from other quarters and could find assistance from China is specifically because of the reason that China does not look at the question of serviceability as stringently as many other agencies do when giving out money. They do not look at questions of governance when they give out money as stringently as many other institutions abroad, international institutions do, which basically means that there is no real substitute for China when it comes to being a lender of last resort. No one else has such deep pockets. No one else is willing to unsee or ignore various other issues that they might have. Now, the other interesting aspect of this is, and this is also something someone mentioned, that Ranil Wickremesinghe, a new government, in a way, represents a kind of a change. So the Rajapaksas are not there. Wickremesinghe has far more acceptability abroad. However, the other aspect of this, what must not be forgotten, is that Ranil Wickremesinghe is also someone, as I think Ambassador Kantha was mentioning, he is the only member of his party in the parliament. He did not, the other part of that is also that he did not win an election to get here. He got there through the proportional representation system that Sri Lanka has, which also means there is far less political capital that he has. He will have to fall back upon many of the established players that are within the Sri Lankan political system to move forward. He will have to take them along as he goes. The earlier Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa may be gone, but his brother Gotabaya Rajapaksa, he still is the president. And again, the Bloomberg interview that others were talking about, he says that he is looking to finish his term. So what I'm going to try and what I'm basically trying to say is that while some things have changed, most certainly Sri Lanka is nowhere close to being out of the woods. It would possibly please a lot of us if we could say that, the kind of predatory policies that we have seen come from China towards Sri Lanka, and we have seen, which I think Ambassador Kantha talked about, the opacity, right? The kind of opacity that has come from China towards these regimes. If we could say that this is going to change or this is going to stop, we would have been very happy. But I don't think that is going to happen anytime soon. Because there will be various pain points, pressure points that Sri Lanka will face going forward. The moment once the IMF deals are negotiated, there will be further pain, there will be further cost cuts that will possibly have to happen. And when they happen, and as Sri Lanka moves forward, the question will be, what role does China play then? Will it continue to be a lender of last resort? Will all regimes, irrespective of color, irrespective of families, will they continue to go to China? Because another thing to remember, President Sirisena in his electoral promises talked about not okaying all Chinese projects, but soon after he took over, he did make a trip to China. He did talk about funds, he did talk about loans, right? So these are some of the considerations that one needs to think of when thinking about the China-Sri Lanka relationship. I'm going to stop there and happy to take any questions that come my way. Thank you.
Thank you, Deep. Thank you for your comments. drawing partly on your very important study on Chinese influence in South Asia, including in Sri Lanka, and also making, raising several important questions, including whether China will be lender of last resort for Sri Lanka. Going by present evidence, China is not inclined to play that role, at least for the time being. Well, now, earlier I planned to pose one question each to three panelists, but since we have limited time available and a lot of questions in the chat box, so let's turn straight away to questions in the chat box. Let me begin with a question by Arush Joshi, which is posed to everyone, but perhaps Michael can take this question. This is about how reliable is India's neighborhood first policy in its vis-a-vis, countries in South Asia, and whether countries tend to tilt towards China and sometimes towards India, depending upon change of leadership in those countries. And Arush has given example of Nepal in that connection. So, Michael, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. My sense is that the results of the neighborhood first policy have been mixed to this point. I think that for me, one of the big stories, one of the big takeaways looking at the landscape is that China has been able to develop a footprint in pretty much every country in SAARC, including in countries that until fairly recently had really been areas where India was the only external player to have a major presence or partnership on the ground, so to speak, considering places like Bhutan and Nepal and Maldives and so on and so forth. And I think also another challenge has been that some of the domestic developments in India, some of the domestic politics, domestic policies have impacted relations between India and some of its neighbors. You look at Bangladesh, for example. Bangladesh's government had responded negatively to this new citizenship law that the government in India had come out with. I think it's clear that those tensions have been generally worked out. They've been managed by India, but the mere fact that Beijing or that China has such a significant presence or has had such a significant presence, mainly through its infrastructure investments in India's backyard for so long, and that's not appearing to end anytime soon. I think that right there indicates the challenge at hand for its neighborhood policy, neighborhood first policy. And it's true that the leadership issues, I think, are a factor here. I mean, we point to Nepal with the change in leadership there, suggesting that the return of the current prime minister could bode well for India's relations with Nepal. Maldives has experienced a similar state of play. Who really knows what to expect with Sri Lanka now, particularly given the comments that that President Rajapaksa made in that article in Bloomberg? I really don't know. My sense is that he's not, so long as he's in power, he's not exactly going to wish that China goes away, so to speak. But bottom line is, I think that the result is mixed to this point with the neighborhood first policy. And I think one thing that we've seen is an effort to for India to promote these sub-regional type arrangements that allow India to strengthen cooperation with those countries that it really gets along the best. And I think we've seen that with the BIMSTEC phenomenon, trying to bypass SAARC and the Pakistan problem that comes with that and focus on BIMSTEC, which could allow India to strengthen relations with most of its South Asian neighbors without the Pakistan factor. Another issue, which I guess is a conversation for another day, is what appears to be India's increasing outreach to Taliban-led Afghanistan, which is very interesting as well. But I think the jury is still out in terms of how far that goes. But it seems that New Delhi is quite serious about at least exploring the realms of possibility for engaging with the Taliban regime in ways that fall short of formal recognition.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Let me now turn to Chulani and direct this question from Apurv Raj. Chulani, you talked about the fact that Sri Lanka was the first country in South Asia which went for economic liberalization it tried to move towards export-led growth model, and instead it ended up with import-led, economy. The question from Apurva is whether post the current economic crisis, Sri Lanka will go for a different kind of economic model. And I'll add my own bit there. Sri Lanka is strategically located, which provides a great advantage to it in terms of its economic potential. Second advantage Sri Lanka has is proximity to India, and the fact that India is a relatively fast-growing large economy. To what extent Sri Lanka is prepared to leverage these advantages when it looks at a different kind of growth model, a sort of departure from earlier model which did quite serve it well, going by evidence of present economic crisis.
I'll start with the part where you had, I think about the advantage that Sri Lanka has, the strategic location and its proximity to India, and leveraging this for Sri Lanka's benefit. This has been theoretically discussed by every single government for a longer period of time. But what we do not actually see is implementation of this, or like there are documentation of policies, but there's no consistency in carrying out those policies. So about the privatization, different kind of model, I think the question specifically mentions about privatization. One of the first things that Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe mentioned in his inaugural speech after being sworn in was that Sri Lanka, like sort of hinted that Sri Lanka would look into privatization as an approach. He specifically mentioned about Sri Lankan Airlines. Now, there are two kinds of approaches that the Sri Lankan economists are promoting. One is the privatization model, the other one is the industrialization model. I think both these models require long-term planning and proper implementation. Sri Lankan, Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe has always been in favor of privatization during his tenures in previous time. Also, he has promoted, his party is center-right, so they have always promoted for more liberalized, more privatized sort of economic model for Sri Lanka. And also, we have a huge bloated government sector, which and institutes that incur a lot of loss over the years. Because of that, also privatization has been promoted and proposed by one sector of the community. The other sectors are sort of like worry about this model if that will impact on welfare services like free education and healthcare in particular. Because as you know, despite all the economic troubles we have we have not had the best economic model for the past year, but our Human Development Index is one of the best in South Asia. This is largely due to the free education and free healthcare model that Sri Lanka has. So moving forward, whether this can be sustained is a question, and whether this is something that can be compromised is also a question. But as Deep also mentioned, with the IMF, there are going to be more and more cost cut requirements that will come. So partly there is a question whether there will be suggestions to privatize these services also. If that happens, what will happen to the human development that Sri Lanka has achieved, where it will go? And on the other hand, how, if we want to continue a free education and free healthcare, where are we going to find the funding as our economy is at this stage right now? So this problem is there. But as I said, there are groups that promote privatization in Sri Lanka, and those who say, like, there are groups who say instead we should more focus on industrialization. But I personally think that these two has to be implemented simultaneously at different stages, because one immediate privatization will lead to a lot of layoffs in public service, and which will lead to unemployment, which will put more pressure on the people as the problems are right now. On the other hand, industrialization also has to kick off, but it will not happen overnight. It will take some time. So because of that, I personally believe these are two policies that has to be carefully thought out and implemented step by step.
Thank you, for very insightful remarks, Chulani. Let me now, direct one question for Onkar Bhole to Dr. Deepal. This question about, what are the key features of China's South Asia policy, and how will the Sri Lankan crisis impact China's South Asia policy?
Right, that's a great question. So what are the key features of China's South Asia policy? I think China's South Asia policy often gets mistaken as an economic one. I believe it is actually a strategic one. It has increasingly become strategic with time. And the reason why initially, at first glance, it looks economic is because China is extremely pragmatic and proactive. So what it does is it approaches these countries and essentially asks them, what is it that you're looking for? What is it that you need? One of the areas in which China has a great deal of capacity is in being able to help with developmental projects, right? Building ports, building highways, roads, and so on and so forth. Now, this is something, connectivity projects, infrastructure projects, is something that all states in South Asia essentially look for. So you will see a similarity in Sri Lanka, in Nepal, in Bangladesh, and elsewhere, where China is helping with these projects. What that does do is essentially allow China a way of making inroads into these countries. And soon after they have made inroads, you will notice that the policy assumes various other dimensions. It assumes political engagements. It works into people-to-people kind of connections. You'll see companies helping build schools, or even finance various kind of facilities for schools, doing various kind of media-related activities, trying to build a discourse that makes them more acceptable, popular, well-known within the communities. So that's in a nutshell a way of looking at Chinese policy in South Asia. Now, what is Chinese policy in South Asia going to be, and how is the Sri Lanka episode going to change it, or if at all? I think, Ambassador Kant, as you mentioned, that for now, China does not look like it wants to be engaged in bailing Sri Lanka out to a great extent. That makes sense. And I think part of that, as I mentioned, is because they don't want this to be a kind of a precedence that they have to practice in other countries. But beyond that, I think they will continue to lead with their strategic objectives. We have recently heard of Xi Jinping talk about the GSI, which is a security-based initiative that they are going to bring to various countries. Now, security is not something that they have directly approached South Asian countries with, except Bangladesh, which buys most of its weaponry from China. But security relationships have been largely on the down low. But we will see more and more security-related strategic initiatives come out directly from China to these countries. China believes it is ascendant. China believes that the West, led by the US, is in terminal decline, irreversible decline. There has been no reason for China to believe that there is a reversal in any of those. And if it believes that it is ascendant and it needs to spread further into and increase its sphere of influence, then South Asia is a very key part of it. As a result, I believe that they will continue to approach countries in South Asia and try to engage with them in more and more ways.
Thanks, Deep. I think we are running out of time, so we'll take one more question and request Chulani to respond to that question. This is about China, seeking an FTA with Sri Lanka, and whether Sri Lanka will go forward with it during this current crisis, and whether it will be helpful to Sri Lanka.
Well, I think if Sri Lanka, even though we claim to be have open to economy, Sri Lanka has not been very pragmatic in approaching countries for free trade agreements. The only free trade agreement that we have right now is with India and Pakistan. And with China, the free trade agreement has been in discussion for a longer period of time, I think over 10 years now. And there has been very interesting studies done by Sri Lanka's think tanks about the advantage in, even though it looked like that Sri Lanka will not be able to export much to China, there are certain products with which Sri Lanka has a great advantage vis-a-vis the rest of the world in exporting to China, and also niche products that are not that Sri Lanka will gain more advantage. So in that sense, I think Sri Lanka is already too late without like for going into FTA. I believe that they will negotiate and even reactivate the FTAs that are in dormant. For instance, the FTA with Singapore, because if we want to, for instance, if we look at being a industrial nation, or like trying to bring more forex into the country, these are the approaches that we can look at. If we look at Bangladesh right now, it is already making the plan of its economy post middle income status, even though it has still not reached there. One of the aspects they're looking at is signing these free trade agreements right now, so that they have better chance of negotiating terms. So at this point, I think it will be tricky for Sri Lanka to negotiate the terms. But FTA with China and all the other trading partners as well is something very important.
Thank you, Chulani. Well, we still have questions in the chat box, but we have unfortunately run out of time, so I'll have to bring this dialogue to an end now. Let me thank three panelists for their very insightful remarks, both during the initial presentations and subsequent responses to questions. I will not try to summarize discussions we had this afternoon or morning, depending upon where you're located, because we had a very extremely rich dialogue. But one thing is clear, that both India, for a variety of reasons, and China, for its own strategic and economic imperatives, are engaged in Sri Lanka and will continue to remain engaged in Sri Lanka. China is facing some questions about what kind of support it can provide to Sri Lanka, including in terms of restructuring of debt. But I have no doubt that Chinese footprint and presence in Sri Lanka will remain quite prominent and will continue to expand in keeping with its larger ambitions in our neighborhood and beyond. I'll make one final point, which I mentioned in my opening remarks also, that though our concerns, India's concerns about China is no doubt an important consideration when it comes to India's proactive policy vis-a-vis Sri Lanka, it will be a mistake perhaps to look at India-Sri Lanka policy primarily through prism of the China factor. As someone who has worked in Sri Lanka, I can tell you that we have a truly multifaceted and strategic engagement with Sri Lanka, with various dimensions which are not necessarily linked to China. I'll conclude here by once again thanking the three panelists, and indeed thanking all the members of the audience for their active participation. Thank you very much.